Right. So from
biggest worry.
Yeah, from my perspective and our members' perspective, I guess the biggest worry is the amount of time left between now and potentially a no deal. We're talking about 170 days, 5.5 months. That's no time. We have no clarity in terms of what the customs process may be in terms of a no deal. In fact, we have no clarity if there is, if indeed there was a deal. We have no clarity at this point in time. But I guess the biggest concern is what is it going to do to borders, and how is it potentially going to slow goods down that are coming through the borders. I think the biggest concern is probably from the UK back to the EU, particularly in Calais, going back through France. We have no clarity again, from the EU or the French in terms of what they're likely to do around a customs process. So I think that's a big concern, and that's clearly going to have a big impact on UK supply chain. The volume that comes from Europe primes the pump. It's volume that's going into national distribution centres, regional distribution centres, manufacturers, and if that volume drops because of delays, that has a knock-on effect in terms of the amount of volume that we distribute as an industry. We are a volume-based industry that reacts to the volume that comes in and what's being delivered. Access to the market is also a really big issue. So again, from our perspective, as soon as we come out of the EU, we forfeit our right to what's called the community licence that allows British hauliers access to the EU. And the only contingency that we have at this point in time are ECMT permits. And those are capped and quoted, and there are 1,224 of those ECMT permits. And there are 38,000 trucks that are licensed to go to the EU. So there is a big gap in terms of the ability, literally, in the event of a no deal, how do we get to Europe?
Who issues those permits?
They're issued by the European Committee for Transport Ministers, and they are capped and quoted by that commission, and they cover 43 states, including the 28 EU. The only other fallback position that we have are bilateral agreements or bilateral permits, and clearly we understand that there are side negotiations that are happening that the EU have tried to close off because that's undermining the overall negotiations. But again, we have no clarity because nothing has been agreed as to whether or not we can fall back on bilateral permits that will allow access back to EU. So that's a big issue. And then labour, the supply of labour, we have a 55,000 driver shortage at the moment. That's getting worse as we speak. The impact of some of the statements that have been made by government around I guess capping the skills level for migrant labour. We have 60,000 EU nationals driving in the UK with HGV licence and 120,000 working in warehouses, and we're starting to see them go back again. The first tranche we started to see go back because of the exchange rate changes, but we're now seeing that labour go back, and we're having a supply issue now, even ahead of our peak for this year. So those are the issues.
Can you just tell us, how would you characterise the nature and extent of the discussion between your industry and the government about all of these very, very practical questions?
Well, I think it's been a painful process.
Painful? It's
been a painful process, and I feel that we've had to push really hard over the last year. October last year was the first time that we really started to engage and raise these issues, and it wasn't really until probably the early part of this year, maybe February, sort of March time, that we had the first detailed conversation saying you're not engaging enough with business to understand what are the practical handshakes that would need to be undertaken at that point in time in order to make sure that we are protecting the flow of goods and the movement.
Let's take a couple of practical examples. One is the potential for queues on the M20, which it would appear the government now gets is a possibility because it's been reportedly making contingency arrangements for how you'd look after drivers who are stuck on the M20 in long queues. So you think that's a possibility, given what Mr. Opie was just saying earlier about delays?
Yes.
You were talking about stuff coming in, but then there's also how will French customs deal with stuff from Britain going out?
Yes.
So that's a concern for you, is it?
It's a real concern,
Right.
and you know, this is not about scaremongering. This is about the reality. If we see delays, if we see a slowing of volume because vehicles are being checked through a customs process, you know, even if you look at Switzerland this week, Basel into Germany, a 12-kilometre queue on a Monday morning trying to get from Basel into Germany. You know, the scale and volume that we're going to be seeing going back. There are 11,000 trucks per day that go through the Calais Straits. Usually about 5,000 or 6,000 going back. It won't take too long if those vehicles are being checked in some way for a queue to start forming on a scale like we haven't seen.
And did it take a long time for the government to clock that this was a real problem in the event of no deal?
I think it's taken this. It's almost been this year that they've really started to wake up to that. And I would say that the real realisation probably was in August, if I'm honest, that actually, from our perspective, some of the things that we've been talking about, real risk, I think, were actually beginning to be listened to.
Can we take one other example, because it's reported in the Times this morning that government officials are discussing the possibility of having to slaughter lambs that are in transit if there are indeed delays. Have they broached this with you as an organisation?
They haven't broached that issue, but you know, certainly there has been a lot of discussion about the amount of fresh. If you think about the Calais Straits, it's the quickest, you know, fastest crossing, and therefore it's used by many trucks and by many hauliers that are moving fresh and live produce. So any delay is going to have a massive impact on the shelf life of that, and yes, certainly from a livestock perspective, then that could also have an impact.
But if it is true, as reported, that government officials are discussing what to do in those circumstances, would you as an organisation expect them to be talking to you about that aspect of contingency planning?
Yes.
And they're not doing so currently?
No.
Right, that's very helpful.